none of that seems realistic. None of that seems loving. And if it's not going to happen in the real scale, the notion that there's some extra supernatural scale where it's somehow justified is bizarre to me. But, oh, you can't compare God to Santa Claus? Yes, I can. Santa Claus has more evidence. That's just a fact. Because there are kids that wake up with presents labeled from Santa. There are kids who go to the mall and see Santa. They're wrong. And that's the thing is, you can be wrong and yet still be reasonable. If the evidence that you have leads to a conclusion, you are reasonable irrespective of whether or not you are ultimately correct. And that's the reason why we have to keep pursuing more information so that we have a better pool to pull from to figure out what we think.
And actually critical of the things that have convinced us in the first place, that looking at the epistemology of what led you to that belief in the first place and evaluating that evidence along the way. Yep.
There's 3 more calls I'm going to try to get to since we're not doing the after show, so we'll do what we can. We have Adele in Oakland. Thanks for waiting.
Hey.
Hey, how are you?
I just wanted to... Good, how are you guys? I talked to you about 3 months ago. I don't know if you remember.
Maybe.
But,
I don't know.
I just wanted to get to the idea where there's God's will, and then versus us having free will, which we could, argue that we don't even have free will, but that's a completely different discussion. But I just wanted to talk about that. And even though it's obviously logically, fallacious, how do you argue with theists on this topic? Because it doesn't seem like it kind of feeds into their idea of, one thing that they agree with is God's will. And then if they disagree with it, like say it's homosexuality, they say, oh, well, that's your free will and you're not doing God's will.
Yeah. So I will set aside the discussion about whether or not we have free will, because my answer is yes or no, depending on how people want to define it. But the notion within particularly Christianity, and I'll just stick there because I think it applies to a good many others, that we have free will is clearly false. And the way I point this out is this. Did God create the universe? They'll say yes. Could God have created a different universe? Some of them will say yes, some of them will say no. If God couldn't create a different universe, then everything is deterministic and God was stuck with this universe. But if they're willing to say yes, so God intentionally created this universe. Does God know what's going to happen in each of the potential universes that he created? Yes, because nothing can happen that doesn't go according to God's plan. That means that God intentionally created the universe in which I become an atheist and go to hell, instead of the universe in which I remain a Christian. So while I would agree with you that from the internal perspective, or I would agree with the Christian, from the internal perspective, I am a thinking agent who takes actions with the appearance of will. I can never do anything that God didn't already know about and specifically pick because he could have created a different universe and didn't. And when you put those 3 elements together, you cannot have a God and free will. You have to either remove, hey, God knows what's going to happen because he's watching it like a movie. We exercised our free will.
Right, then he's not all-knowing.
Yeah. Or God created the universe but didn't have any option, in which case it's all deterministic and God's irrelevant to it. Or God created the universe, could have created a different one, but doesn't know what's going to happen. And under that one, you get it. But when you put all 3 of them together, which is the foundation of Christianity, that there are prophecies and God knows what's going to happen and God knows when the end is, and he knows who's going to heaven and who's not, and he knows the number of hairs on your head, which for me is not as hard as it is for other people. When you put all those things together, you can't have free will under any model.
So then how, at that point, what is their reasoning for, being made sick and then, being commanded to be well? How do they justify, how could anybody be wrong for what they do?
Because they don't agree with me and they say that you still have free will. They just don't understand that trilemma. And so their argument is basically the whole argument for free will everywhere, within theism and without, is it feels like I have free will, therefore I do. That's as close as anybody can get to a definition of free will, to defining that we in fact have free will, because it feels like we do. But if in fact we don't, and it's just the case that we feel like we do, then even feeling like we do isn't evidence that we do.
Okay. So they would argue that we feel like we have free will, we don't, but then how could they get offended if we do things that are considered sin, if we don't have free will?
Because God's offended. They're offended on God's behalf.
Okay, but how could God be offended if God didn't create us with free will?
Because God's a dick.
Okay. Well, it just seems like the whole thing, to me, is a parallel of a narcissist and a codependent. That's what the relationship kind of seems like.
Yeah. You are not wrong. And I can't really tell you more. What I will say is go out and ask them. Go out and have the conversation.
I do. This is why I'm having the conversation with you. This is because I've had these conversations, and I don't know how to get past that, cognitive dissonance. I don't know what to do other than
that's tough.
In my, participate in discussions like this and have, join debate in other areas so that people who are searching will see these conversations. That's like the best thing I feel like I can do.
You have to find the people who actually care about truth and are willing to acknowledge, honestly, when the path that they've chosen that they think leads them to truth doesn't. Because I know people that I've interacted with recently who don't care at all about data because the data could be wrong. How do you know? How do you trust that data? And I was like, okay, I've got data. What have you got? Oh, I got personal testimony from people. And I not kidding, I know people who value personal testimony and experience.
Well, if they value personal testimony, bring up your own personal testimony.
Yeah, they don't value mine so much.
Right, because it's not the right kind.
Because mine is my personal testimony, which brings up data.
Got it.
Because I've had a similar discussion when you talk about God's will and like even the good things and the bad things in life. That's all part of God's plan. Yeah. That even though you lost your job, you lost your car, something like that, it's going to
make you stronger.
It's going to work out according to God's plan. And when I talk about like our own actions, like the actions that we take when someone hurts someone else, and I'm like, was that also a part of God's plan? If God's plan is everything that we see and everything that we do is a part of His plan, then that person that murdered another, was that a part of the plan? I remember a conversation where it was, that was the devil tempting you.
Yeah.
Oh, that was a demon that was tempting your actions. That wasn't God though. It wasn't God that happened, but I'm like, well,
the devil has power over God in that.
Right. And that's kind of where it kind of goes out. And I was like, well, isn't everything supposed to happen according to God's will, God's plan? So the plan was for the devil to take control of this person,
just
and
like he did with Job.
This other, and I'm just like,
together.
They've been working together.
Douchebag of a deity.
It's right there in the book.
I don't know what to say.
They worked together. They worked together to screw over Job. They worked together at a number of points. Actually, Satan is the accuser who works for God. This notion that Satan, Lucifer, Beelzebub, devil are independent is one notion from Scripture. Then there's one that glom them all together as different names for the same being, and that's not actually evident, which is the reason why both Jesus and Lucifer are referred to as morning star. I mean, it's weird. Now, I've had this discussion. Andrea Yates, the woman who drowned her kids so they would go to heaven. I had a discussion recently with somebody about this. They agreed those kids went to heaven. That, kids who are below the age of reason or whatever, they go, boom, do not pass go straight up to Jesus.
Well, I heard that nobody knows if they go to heaven or not, that God judges it just depending on what He feels like.
Yeah, but if you agree that those kids went to heaven, then she did the best thing she could possibly do for her kids, even potentially damning herself.
Justifiable and within God's will.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so the person I was talking to was like, no, she was just crazy or evil or whatever. I was like, okay, I agree with you that what she did was awful. But if you look at it from within the doctrine, she did the best thing. What greater love could you have than to kill your kids and guarantee that they go to heaven if your doctrine is correct? But here's the thing. Irrespective of the doctrine, that had to be part of God's plan. God's plan was for a woman to get famous for intentionally drowning her kids so that they would go to heaven. Now, I don't know I think that if there is a God, he's an idiot. But if I was God and I didn't want people to drown their kids, I would make it clear that drowning your kids is not going to get you to heaven, that it's not within my will. Instead, this God seems to have said, I'm really not going to tell them very clearly about how this whole getting to heaven thing works. And I'm going to make sure that this one woman gets famous for doing the exact thing that I don't want people to do, and then I'm not going to clarify on it at all. Now, that God is either an idiot or a dick, or both.
Well, you know, there's nothing better. There's only one thing better than going to heaven, and that's taking somebody with you. So maybe she read that, and that was her interpretation of that scripture.
That could be.
But it just also goes into, then what's the point of praying? Because I've heard, well, you didn't pray correctly when things don't get answered the way that they need to. But what's the point of praying if when you pray, God's will is already determined? So what's the point?
Will God's plan change based on your prayer?
That's what George Carlin joked about. But
so there is a way around that. That's, as far as I can tell, doctrinal. Prayer is not to get things. Prayer is just you sucking up to God. It is you, hey, and so the prayer is, thy will be done. You're just sitting here saying, yes, God, I am in fact a plaything in your grand cosmic show, and I am happy for your will to be done. As if God would care whether or not you're happy about it. As a matter of fact, it means that it was God's will for you to be happy that his will be done.
Well, that sounds like a narcissist. We're saying, hey, narcissist, tell me how to stroke your ego so that you'll treat me better.
Yes, except in this case, the narcissist has made it so that you want to stroke his ego or don't want to stroke his ego based on his whim. You know, I really like Phil, so I want Phil to stroke my ego, but I don't like Joe over there, so I'm going to make sure Joe doesn't stroke my ego so that I can send him to heaven or to hell. Anyway, we're running out of time.
In the meantime, anyway, yeah.
I appreciate the call, Adele. Thank you.
Thanks for taking my call.
Yep.
All right, take care.
Thank you.
All right, we are running into overtime now. Alexander in Oklahoma, what have you got for us? Welcome to the show.
Oh wow. Okay, cool. Interesting. Cool. I'm surprised I'm actually talking to you, Matt. I've seen you all over YouTube.
I'm here all the time.
Wow. Okay, this is really
or a
cool.
lot.